Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Just a little bit before Valentine's Day, the most useless,
Did you get your wonderful wife something nice for Valentine's Day?
most miserable holiday there is in the history of holidays, where every man across the fruited plain is damned if he doesn't, damned if he doesn't. We'll all be in trouble on February 15th. Let's commiserate and just move on. So, Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week now that you've ruined my day?
When we first started Words and Numbers, one of our early episodes, we mentioned the UK Polar Explorer program's contest to name its $300 million ship.
I remember this.
They made the mistake of asking the internet. What came back in a landslide, the name for the $300 million ship, was Bodie McBoatface. Of course, the people couldn't deal with something as whimsical as that, so they named it Sir David Attenborough. This came a couple of decades after Canada was looking to rename the Northwest Territories. Of course, this was prior to the internet, so the best people could do was get second runner-up, but their second runner-up name was Bob. Of course, that didn't go anywhere. Following on the footsteps of all of this, the Minnesota Department of Transportation has recently launched a contest to name its snowplow. The top 4 candidates from the bottom up: Plowosaurus Rex, the Big Laplowski, Control Salt Delete, and the winner, which it seems that the Minnesota Department of Transportation is going to actually put this name on the snowplow, Betty Whiteout, in honor of the late Betty White.
Well, you know, it's hard to be angry about anything that mentions or honors Betty White.
Isn't it great? But look, the thing is this. The minority of us who take pretty much everything too seriously seem to get all the press. In contests like this, it's a nice reminder that many of us retain a good sense of whimsy.
So, Ant, I want to talk about the IRS, of all things. Have you seen the recent headline?
I saw 2 things. One, that the IRS wanted to use facial recognition, and the other, they backed off of that when everybody lost their minds.
The IRS needs to go right off. What in God's green earth is wrong with those people? Well, I guess what's wrong with them is that nobody ever tells them no, and they get rather used to always doing what they want. But, Ant, I want to talk about another form of their incompetence. Here's a headline for you. IRS backlog hits nearly 24 million returns, further imperiling the 2022 tax filing system.
Yeah, 24 million returns from last year.
Not only last year, primarily from last year, but from years prior to that as well. Because apparently, they'll come down on you like a ton of bricks if you don't get your return in on time, but they don't really feel the need to read it on time.
I have personal experience with this. My son's return. Now, my son filed on time, prior to April 15th, and it was a 1040 EZ, the simplest form that the IRS produces. He didn't get his refund until mid-August.
Oh, wow.
Now, if he had owed money and waited till mid-August to pay it, there would have been all hell to pay.
That's right, and he would have had to add fees and interest, and I would sure like to see fees and interest go the other way. The IRS, obviously, one of my least favorite things in the entire world.
Well, I can't imagine that somebody posed with a straight face this idea of the facial recognition business, because it was just a year ago, not even a year ago, that somebody managed to get hold of millions of IRS records that are supposedly confidential. Now, if the IRS can't keep its current data confidential, what's going to happen if they have facial recognition data on all of us?
I don't even know why they would want that. It doesn't exactly flow naturally from the things they have to do. So now I guess I'm going to talk about something that's even more stupid. The foolishness of the week. We're going to go not to national politics, but to local politics in a story that I turned up on reason.com. I'll give you the headline first. Ohio mayor warns that ice fishing will lead to prostitution.
How does that work?
Who could be so stupid as to string those thoughts together? Ice fishing was not even allowed. Now, I happen to think ice fishing one of the dumbest things I've ever seen. But you got to get out of the house, you got to get out of the house. Here is the line of reasoning. Let me read to you. If you open this up to ice fishing, while on the surface it sounds good, then what happens next year? Does someone come back and say, I want an ice shanty? If you allow ice fishing with shanties, then that leads to another problem, prostitution. So the line of reasoning here is, you want to cut a hole in a lake and drop a hook down there and fish. And then the next thing you're going to want is what's functionally about the size of an outhouse that you could sit in as you drop your hook down. And apparently because you can sit in something about the size of an outhouse, prostitution in the ice shanties. How does anybody take this clown seriously?
Is this a problem? Do we see this happening other places where there's ice fishing?
You mean the gigantic problem of prostitution on frozen lakes?
Armies of prostitutes following the ice fishermen.
I wonder if they come out on skates. Do they leave truck stops in favor of frozen lakes? These are all questions that need to be answered. But bless Reason Magazine for dredging this stuff up and presenting it not only to me, but to this clown's constituents.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. If you'd like to support Words and Numbers, make your way over to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers, where you can contribute to our podcast-making habits. If you'd like to schedule us to come speak at your event, be it corporate or educational, or have James officiate at your wedding, send us an email at wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com. This week, David Friedman joins us. David Friedman is an economist, physicist, and legal scholar. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics from the University of Chicago, but his research interests include economics, law, and anarcho-capitalism. He has written numerous books, including Price Theory, The Machinery of Freedom, Guide to a Radical Capitalism, Law's Order, What Economics Has to Do with Law, Hidden Order, The Economics of Everyday Life, and Future Imperfect, Technology and Freedom in an Uncertain World. Professor Friedman was professor of law at Santa Clara University. This conversation goes into some depth regarding banking that may be new to most listeners. To help clarify the topic, I'll insert commentary from time to time explaining some of the terms that David uses. To keep clear what's commentary and what's part of the original conversation, I'll introduce each comment with this tone. David, welcome to Words and Numbers.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We actually got a question from one of our listeners asking what would happen if a major country went back on a gold standard. Let's start at a high level. Why have a gold standard at all? And given that there is some reason, why did we leave it?
Well, the argument for a commodity standard.
There are two broad classifications of monetary systems, commodity systems and fiat systems. A commodity system is a monetary system in which there is some object, perhaps gold, perhaps silver, that's used as the unit of currency. A fiat system is a monetary system in which the currency is not backed by any tangible object.
The argument for a commodity standard, it could be gold or silver or something else, is that it is a way of maintaining the value of your money such that there is nobody who can easily change it. That a fiat standard properly run is in some ways the ideal monetary system because it provides the services of money without having to dig any gold out of the ground. But the problem with the fiat system is that there are some institutions running it, and their incentives may lead to inflation or conceivably even a fall in prices. So the nice thing about a commodity standard is that it gives you a way of fixing the value of the money, making it reasonably stable. The two disadvantages of a commodity standard, one of them is it's expensive. You've got to dig up a bunch of gold, although there's a way of reducing that, which I can get to in a minute. And the other is that the value of your commodity might change. Late 19th century, more countries are going on gold. Not much gold is being mined, and economies are expanding. So that means that prices are generally falling. That's fine for some people. That's fine if you're a lender, but it's a problem if you're a debtor and didn't anticipate that. And then what happens next is that you have two changes. You have the discovery of the South African gold fields, and you have the invention of the cyanide process for extracting gold from low-grade ore. And suddenly gold goes from being a recessionary metal to being an inflationary metal. prices start going up. Now, none of that is on the scale of what can happen with a fiat system that goes bad, that you're talking about, an inflation of percent or 2 or 3 a year, not about an inflation of 100% a month. But nonetheless, those are the two in principle disadvantages. But I doubt that either of them is the reason that countries actually abandoned the gold standard. And I think the reason they abandoned the gold standard was that it was a constraint on things that governments wanted to do. There is a way of maintaining a gold standard that doesn't require that much gold, and that's having fractional reserve banks.
A fractional reserve bank is a bank that is not required to have as much commodity on hand as it has dollars deposited at the bank. For example, if customers have deposited $1 million at the bank, by law, the bank may only need to have $100,000 in gold on hand. That is, 10% of the deposits have to be backed by gold.
There is a way of maintaining a gold standard that doesn't require that much gold, and that's having fractional reserve banks. From my standpoint, the ideal monetary system is competing private issuers.
Private issuers are banks that print their own currency. Rather than the dollars being printed by a central bank like the Federal Reserve, banks print their own dollars.
From my standpoint, the ideal monetary system is competing private issuers, agreeing on a common standard. And then if what you have is a bank which has deposits of 10,000 ounces of gold, it holds 5,000 ounces of gold actually in its safe, and it then has other assets which it can sell for another 5,000 if it needs to. So now it tells people, anytime you want your gold, come get it. If lots of people come get it, you liquidate some other assets and restock your gold reserves. So that's a workable system. That's basically the Scottish system of the 18th century. And that gives you reasonably stable money. And according to what the reserve ratio is, it means that you only have to tie up half as much or a quarter as much or a tenth as much gold as with a 100% reserve commodity system. So it certainly is a workable system. Now, in my view, the ideal commodity system doesn't use gold. The ideal commodity system uses a market basket, because with any single commodity, there is the risk that some economic factor might make that commodity either much more expensive or much less expensive. For example, going back to your initial question, suppose a small country goes on the gold standard. Nothing much happens in the rest of the world as a result. But now, suppose the idea spreads and most of the major countries of the world go on the gold standard. Well, what's going to happen is that the price of gold is going to go up. You've got a new demand for gold. The result of that is that the poor country that started is going to somehow observe that prices are going to drop very sharply, measured in terms of gold. And that's going to cause fairly severe problems because people made contracts which assumed that when you agreed to a certain payment, that represented a certain amount of value. And now it turns out that I owe you 3 times what I thought I owed you in purchasing power because gold has just tripled its price. Now, that's not a very serious problem. I'm taking the sort of extreme case that the whole world goes to gold, and that would be a major increase in demand. And historically, my impression is that even the famous gold inflation that happened as a result of the discovery of the New World was a very slow inflation by our standards. And I think you're really talking about 1% a year, I don't remember the exact numbers, but that kind of scale. But in principle, the ideal solution is that instead of saying, if you bring in $1 Friedman dollar, I will give you a tenth of an ounce of gold, I say, if you bring in $1 million Friedman dollars, I'll give you 3 ounces of gold and 40 bushels of grade A wheat and. So if you do that right, that's sort of the theoretically ideal commodity standard, because now you've got a bundle of things which roughly represents the price index, so to speak. And now that'll be very stable. If any one of them gets more expensive or less expensive, it won't have a very large effect. It's not clear that's worth doing because, as I say, it's a more complicated system. But if you're just thinking in terms of theoretical elegance of monetary system, it's the right way of doing it. And the basic argument for the private fractional reserve issuers is that they have the right incentives and governments don't. So that the private fractional reserve issuers, each of them knows that if he issues enough of his money so that its value starts to fall, now everybody will want to come in and collect the commodity. And I should say this issue is discussed by Adam Smith. Recently, I was reading von Mises, and von Mises has an explanation of why a private fractional reserve bank won't be able to greatly expand the system. And that explanation is Smith's explanation, a little bit changed. So that's, I think, the ideal system from my standpoint, at least. We have multiple private issuers, ideally standardizing on a single unit so that you can exchange. Now, I should say standardizing at all is much less important than it used to be. I like to say that the Europeans achieved a common currency just as it became unnecessary, because the problem with multiple currencies is arithmetic. Computers do arithmetic fast and cheap. So as it now is, I can go to London, put my credit card into a money machine, an ATM, and draw British pounds out of the US dollar account. I can buy something in England or France or Italy with my American credit card. Now, it's a little bit inconvenient still, because if I look at a price in England or Italy or some other country, I've got to do a mental translation. Is that a good price? Is that a so it would be a little easier if we all had currency which was in the same units, but it's not nearly as important as it was 20 or 30 years ago, when you had to actually change stuff and you ended up with jars full of extra coins that you hadn't used up from your last foreign trip and so forth.
Tying the dollar to a basket of goods is interesting. I would imagine that some smart people on Wall Street would figure out how to put together a portfolio of futures options or something and then sell shares on it like they did with the mortgage-backed security thing, to provide a paper version of the basket of commodities.
If I may pile on just a little bit, it's actually quite fascinating what you're talking about here. And I think a lot of our listeners are going to say, hey, wait a minute, Friedman, do we not have to have gold at all?
We obviously don't have to gold because Scotland was on the silver standard. Gold is convenient, it's traditional, but the big advantages of gold no longer matter. The two big advantages of gold historically were, first, that it has a very high value to weight. And therefore, if you're using physical coins, you imagine a steel standard, your coins should be rather heavy.
Right.
And the second advantage is that it is relatively easy to identify pure gold. Until modern days, gold was the densest material known. So that meant that it's pretty easy, not trivial, pretty easy to say, all right, put this in a liquid, see how much it displaces, see how much has a weight. Yes, that's really gold. Also, it's moderately clear. Pure gold is soft, so you can tell if it's, I don't know if there is anything you could alloy which would keep it soft, but certainly the ordinary alloys are harder. So therefore, that was very convenient. But nowadays, we're not really talking about coins. People could use coins, be very nice, but you're talking about either paper money, banknotes, or deposits. And in either case, the actual commodity is sitting in a warehouse somewhere or a vault somewhere. And it doesn't really matter very much whether it's steel or gold. A ton of steel doesn't take up much space either, although it's rather hard to lug around. So in that sense, I think gold and to a lesser degree silver were very useful historically, but there's nothing special nowadays other than the fact that it's tradition, that what you really want is just some obligation by the bank to redeem its notes in something such that you're maintaining a reasonably predictable value.
We've been off the gold standard for a long time, and since 2008, the Federal Reserve has been significantly expanding the money supply, much more so since the COVID era. And yet people would always say to me, well, if you have an unbacked currency and the Federal Reserve prints a bunch of it, you should get inflation. And we went for a long time without seeing significant inflation. Why do you think that's so?
I don't know. That's an interesting puzzle. And my own professional interests are not in macroeconomics. So I think part of what seems to have been happening was the Fed started paying interest on reserves, which meant that the Fed was in effect printing money and then borrowing it back. But I just don't know enough to know if that's a full explanation of what was going on, because it's indeed a very odd situation, and now inflation has started. But even now, given how large the expansion of the money supply was, it still seems as though the inflation ought to be larger than it is currently. But I'm afraid you'd have to find some economist who really was a specialist in that sort of stuff to give you an answer, because I agree that it is puzzling that we have not had the level of inflation what you expect given the amount of money printing.
Could you tell us a bit about free banking?
Sure. Free banking is a system where private firms are allowed to issue currency or hold deposits, checking accounts essentially. I've actually been having some interesting arguments with some of the Austrian economists, which got me reading Mises. And it turns out that Mises was in favor of free banking. that his follower Rothbard is on the other side. Rothbard claims you have to require 100% reserves.
Requiring 100% reserves means that for every dollar someone has deposited at a bank, the bank would have to have $1 worth of gold on hand.
Rothbard claims you have to require 100% reserves, but what Mises sees as the least bad system is private banks, which are going to be fractional reserve banks, but they're not going to have a very low fraction because they have a low fraction, people won't trust them, and then there'll be a run on their money and they'll get in trouble. But so the basic free banking system is that banks are under the same laws as anybody else is. They're obliged to fulfill their contracts. If I look at the Scottish system, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, you've got multiple banks. The banks typically, in order to make sure that even if things go badly, they can fulfill their contracts, they were unlimited liability partnerships, and one of the partners would be wealthy. So that means that even if somebody breaks into the vault and steals all their gold, well, that's going to be unfortunate for the wealthy partner, but they're going to eventually be able to pay back on their notes. So I could imagine in a modern world, if you wanted to do the equivalent of that, you would have some firm which has very large total assets. Google or Apple or somebody could issue money and they agree to give you your gold or whatever the commodity is in exchange. And you can be pretty sure they're not going to go bankrupt.
In a free banking system, does the currency have to be backed by something, or can it be a purely fiat currency like we have now?
That depends whether or not anybody will accept it.
Okay.
The rules of free banking don't tell you what the outcome is going to be. But I would have said that it is unlikely that you would have a pure fiat system, because with the pure fiat system, I, as an individual bank, always have an incentive to print more of it because I'm getting, in effect, something for free. And there isn't the constraint that if I print more of it, its value goes down and people come in and want their gold. Now, of course, you could have a pure fiat system if there was some constraint on production. So that's the Bitcoin story. That Bitcoin, in a certain sense, is a pure fiat system, but a pure fiat system set up mathematically so that nobody can knit money for free. The trouble with Bitcoin from that standpoint is that just like a gold standard, you're using real resources to produce your money.
Right.
Because the constraint on Bitcoin is you've got to do a bunch of mathematical processing in order to be allowed. Now, it's not a complete dead weight because part of that processing is keeping the Bitcoin system going, updating the blockchain. But nonetheless, it's in a sense a dead weight. So the ideal system in that sense would be if you imagine that you had some completely worthless commodity or almost worthless commodity, which there was no way of making any more of. And if you could then persuade everybody to use that as your money, it would suddenly get its value from the fact people are using it as money.
Right.
And that's a demand and no resources are used to produce it. I find it hard to think of a plausible way of doing it. But what is true is that a commodity system where the fractional reserve is a low fraction is very close to a fiat in terms of cost because you only have 10% of the gold. And in fact, the earliest thing I know on this subject, implicit, not explicit, is by David Ricardo. David Ricardo was, in my view, the first great economic theorist. Adam Smith was a very good and interesting person, but he didn't really have a worked out theory of how the economy worked. And Ricardo sort of starts his principles by saying, I'm a great admirer of Adam Smith. Any place I don't say I disagree with him, you can assume I agree with him. Here is why he was wrong.
Yeah.
And demonstrates in a very simple way that if Smith's account of what determined prices were true, you would get an impossible result. I won't go through the details of that. But Ricardo has this really neat discussion where he says, suppose that you have a country which uses gold as money, and all of the gold is mined in that country, and that's all it's used for. In that case, he says, you could have a tax that nobody paid. You have a tax on gold mining. The result is that you produce half as much gold, but the value of gold is twice as large. His point is that what matters for your coin is not how much it weighs, but how much it's worth. Consequently, you would be saying that the tax would in effect be paid out of the savings in gold mining. But the gold mines would be all right because they'd be getting twice as much per ounce for their gold, half of which then goes to the government as taxes. But if you think about it, what that really is doing is saying, well, look, as the tax goes to infinity, you're getting fiat money. You're getting smaller and smaller and smaller coins.
Right.
He didn't make that step. And the point at which I got interested in that was when a friend of mine published this really neat article in the American Economic Review, in which he was reinventing Ricardo's idea in a much less important context and didn't realize he was doing it. The title of it was Diamonds Are a Government's Best Friend, Burden-Free Taxation. And his point was that people value diamonds not for their size, but for their price. That what you really want on your finger is not a 1 carat diamond, it's a $5,000 diamond. It's a way of showing off. So he says if you tax the diamond production, you produce less diamonds, but they're worth more per carat. So no one is worse off, and the government collects the tax. And so I put a very brief article in the AER, comment on it, pointing out that he just reinvented David Ricardo's argument, although Ricardo's the much more important because it suggests that the incentive for both fractional reserve banking and fiat money. Quang Ung, he's a Vietnamese Australian economist, very bright guy. I think, well, almost the only utilitarian I know. Ung sent back that he'd gotten in touch with somebody who could make contacts to the spirit world, and that Ricardo said he didn't mind.
Going back to free banking, I'm correct. We had free banking in this country up until...
Yes and no. In the 19th century, there was a so-called wildcat banking, and that was a form of free banking, but I gather it was a fairly heavily regulated form of free banking. And in particular, I understand that part of the problem was that these were state-chartered banks, and the state would require that their reserves largely be in state securities. So if the state securities turned out to be unsound, that meant the bank could go broke. This is not something I've ever researched myself. This is my memory of what I've been told about it. My impression is it was still much better than badly functioning fiat systems. That is to say that once in a while a bank went broke and people lost some money in that bank. But then at the moment, if you're holding money, you're losing about 8% of it a year. So that's roughly what the current inflation rate is. And that's a system that isn't working very badly. The real collapses of fiat systems are 100% a year, 100% a month, depending on which hyperinflation you're thinking. It's not clear to me that we would have been worse off if we had even had that system. But as far as I can tell, a properly working free banking system is just fine. Now, I should say, Mises points out that the problem with free banking is the political problem, that there are various ways in which the government may decide that by changing the contracts, in particular by saying the banks are not required to redeem their notes, it can produce something it wants to produce. But assuming that you can get the government to behave itself, then it seems to me that the free banking is the least bad system that I can think of for money.
How recently was Scotland on a free banking system?
It was on it when Adam Smith was writing in 1776. And I think it goes off in the early 19th century. I think at some point, at least, the government is interfering with banking rules, and eventually the Bank of England takes over. But again, I know about the 18th century partly because I've read a little bit about it and I've read Smith's description of it, but I don't really know the history since then. The person you want to get on that is Larry White, who wrote, I think, a book about that. He was a grad student at UCLA when I was teaching there. I once had the very embarrassing experience of running into somebody in some social occasion and started explaining to him about Larry White's stuff on free banking and then discovering it was Larry White. I had seen him as a graduate student. It wasn't like I knew him. I'm not very good on faces anyway.
Right.
That's not embarrassing. That's hilarious. If I could draw your attention back to where Anthony started, what would it look like on the ground if we did go to a commodities-backed standard? Would there be a convulsion? Would we all be uncomfortable for a while, or would it work straight off?
Well, assuming that the commodity was one with a reasonably stable price and that our going on the standard didn't much change its price, it would mean that the government would no longer have the option of deficit spending with the Fed buying the bonds. Government could still do deficit spending. They just have to borrow the money out on the ordinary capital market. It's an interesting question. My inclination is that the Keynesian view of the need for governments to stabilize things is mistaken, but I could be wrong. But even if you believe in that view, you could do that by running deficit spending and just borrowing money. You don't have to have the Fed. Again, it's not really my field, but I can't see any particular reason why, if you switch to a commodity standard, anything catastrophic would happen.
You said something that I've been worrying about for some time, and I'll paraphrase. It's beneficial to a government to be on a fiat currency because you can deficit spend.
Not only you can deficit spend, but you can, in effect, use the printing press.
Yes, exactly.
The U.S. historically is not a very serious example of that. But there certainly have been countries. The famous example would be Weimar Germany, but also Hungary in roughly the same period, and Venezuela more recently, where the government wants money, so they print money. Mm-hmm. And that results in prices going up very rapidly.
What bothers me is the rise in cryptocurrency. I can easily see the way things have gone in the past, that the world will move toward cryptocurrency. And so long as it remains private, I find it fascinating. But I can't see the government tolerating that.
Part of the attraction of things like Bitcoin is that they need a lot less toleration. I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of Chalmian digital cash, but well before Bitcoin, a Dutch cryptographer called David Chalm described a way in which you could have a fully anonymous digital cash, in which basically I can make a payment to you by sending you a message. You don't have to know who I am. I don't have to know who you are, only how to get the message to you. And the result is that some money is now under your control instead of under my control. The problem with Chalmian digital cash is it required an issuer. It required a bank which held ordinary money in the normal fashion, was exchanging messages with people, but the bank didn't have to know who its depositors were. Therefore, it could be entirely private. I should say Bitcoin is not a fully private cash. As far as I know, none of the cryptocurrencies are. There have been some attempts, and I haven't really followed them. But the problem with that is that once you have a fully anonymous digital currency, money laundering laws become unenforceable. Governments don't like that. Not unreasonably. That is, there are downsides as well as upsides to that. Kidnapping for ransom becomes much more practical if you have anonymous digital cash. Consequently, I think no respectable country would accept a bank under its jurisdiction that was running Chalmian digital cash. But you need a respectable country in order to have a bank which you trust to fulfill its obligations. So therefore, it never came into existence. The beautiful thing about Bitcoin is it doesn't require an issuer. You know, it's true a government that tries hard enough might be able to suppress it, but it's hard. The government can't just say, we won't license the bank that's supposed to be operating, but we'll shut down that bank because there isn't any bank. I've got an old piece called A World of Strong Privacy. I think that was probably written before Bitcoin, but in which I'm discussing the ways in which public key encryption could make possible a world where a very large part of human activity was not under government control. Not because it was illegal for the government to control it, because there was no way of doing it. People are curious. You can go on my webpage, which is daviddfriedman.com, and look at my old articles, and one of them is called A World of Strong Privacy. Or you can read my book, Future Imperfect, where I've got a chapter or two discussing the same issues. That book is in print from Amazon. And one part of it nowadays would be something like Bitcoin. When I wrote it, I was thinking in terms of Chalmian digital cash, which didn't happen. People worry a lot about computer technology, either making possible a sort of Stalinist state or eliminating privacy. And all of that is possible. But the same technologies also have potentials to go exactly opposite direction, because public key encryption makes it possible to have a world where I can talk to someone, even someone I've never met, in a way in which no third party can observe. And I can make cash payments that no third party can observe. You can't regulate something you can't see. Part of the fun of my book, Future Imperfect, and some other things, is seeing how wide the range is of possible futures enabled by different technologies. In this case, it's a technology we've had for decades. Public key encryption is a very powerful and important technology. It's in common use, and it could be used in ways that would make a society where governments had much less power.
David, this has been great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, David.
Happy to do it.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week when we talk about things that don't involve prostitutes in ice shanties in Ohio. Until then, you can follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes, and not for nothing, but I probably will continue venting my spleen there. Come for that and stay for all of the other fun things. You can also follow us on Words and Numbers Backstage, where the conversation continues. Just search for it on Facebook and you'll find it. And you can also, I'm going to say it this time, Aunt, you could also email us, because Aunt loves this so much. Yesterday at the wordsandnumbers.gmail, words and numbers.
He doesn't even know the email address.
Just go up. At wordsandnumbers@gmail.com.
No, that's not it.
Wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
There you go.
we received a couple of notifications that our application for the online dating system is complete, and we can start doing whatever we want to look for love in all the most idiotic places. So
Watch out. We might take up ice fishing.
Certainly easier and cheaper than having a mistress. But anyway, what has happened here is that your beloved email address has been co-opted by all the scam artists, and now we're getting that too. So that's just swell. And you're going to still say the idiotic thing you're going to always say. So go ahead.
Send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
And I'll catch you later. Have a good week. And please, everyone, try. It's okay if you don't succeed at first. It's like quitting smoking or quitting drinking. Every time you try, it gets a little easier next time. So just try to be nice to each other. See you next week, Ant.
See you next week, James.